Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Inside Israel with Joel Chasanoff. I am Joel Chasanoff, coming to you from Israel this evening. It's April 25th, 2024, at least where you are. I'm a little bit in the future. I'm on April 26th already. It's just after 4 o'clock in the morning here. And tonight's episode is called In Every Generation. There's this idea in the Passover Seder that in every generation, each of us needs to imagine that we ourselves came out of Egypt. It's not enough just to tell the Passover story. We need to actually imagine that we ourselves were there. In Hebrew, b'chol dor v'dor chayav ben adam le'ot et atzmo ke'ilu hu yatsa mimitzrayim. And I had an incident over the past week that made me question how viable this actually is. It was probably the final day of Passover shopping, and I was in a store waiting in long lines. As you can imagine, the lines are very long here in Israel leading up to Passover as we all vie for the goods and the paper plates, etc. And I ran into an old friend of mine that I hadn't seen in a couple of years, and he happened to walk into the store as I was waiting in line. His name is Ariel. And what would you say if you saw an old friend of yours that you hadn't seen in a while? You'd casually just say, "Hey, great to see you. How are you?" That's what I said. And you'd expect that he'd say, "Fine, how are you?" But instead he said, "Terrible." And I said, "Why? What's going on?" And he said, "I guess you didn't hear. My sister's son was killed in Gaza on February 6th. And since then, the family's been crushed. Nothing has been the same. We're just terrible." And even though it was his nephew, his family too was crushed by this harrowing incident where his nephew was killed in Gaza. And we had a small conversation as we stood there in the store about just what his sister and their family and the entire family is going through. Logistically, the sister and her husband and other kids live in Jerusalem, and they're really unable to do anything. They're unable to function. So every Friday, my friend Ariel and his family, they do the shopping for Shabbat. They bring the food, drive down to Jerusalem, and make the Shabbat dinner there. And I asked him, how is your sister doing? Is she any better? Are there any signs of progress emotionally now that we're 2 months out? And he said something that got me really thinking about this concept of in every generation, we must see it as if we ourselves came out of Egypt. He said, the emotion that she's experiencing is an emotion you don't know exists until, God forbid, you experience it. Those were pretty much his exact words. And it made me wonder if all of our talk about sympathizing with the hostages and having our hearts with the families who've lost sons and daughters in this war, if it's actually really possible to imagine what they're going through. I don't think it is. When Ariel said this, that this is an emotion you don't even know exists until you experience it, it drove home the point that there's always going to be this distance between those of us who are fortunate enough not to have to experience what these families are and those who have. And what I want to do tonight is talk a little bit about what Passover has been like here in Israel. We always say, "Ma nishtana halayla hazeh," how different this night is. It's actually not a question, it's a statement. In the Passover Haggadah, we don't say, "How is this night different?" We say, "How different this night is." It's a statement. But this year, we have all felt it. And I'm sure you as well at your Passover Seders were cognizant that this Seder has been unlike any other we have ever had. I will tell you this. The number one thing that I have heard Israelis say during this Passover holiday is it just doesn't feel right to say Chag Sameach, happy holiday, not when there are still hostages in Gaza. Over and over, as I would greet people before the holiday and on the holiday itself, and even now, it's we're all searching for the right words. We'll either say Chag Sameach Im efshar lehagid kaze davar. Like happy holiday if we're even allowed to say that kind of a thing. Or people will say, אני רוצה להגיד חג שמח, אבל לא יכול, לא יכולה. I want to say happy holiday, but I don't feel I can. No one here is unaware of the fact that this is a very different Passover, and we feel very uncomfortable wishing each other a happy holiday because we know that it just doesn't make sense to celebrate Chag HaCherut. One of the names of Passover is Chag HaCherut, Chag of Freedom, the holiday of freedom. It doesn't make sense to celebrate the holiday of freedom when we still have 133 hostages in Gaza right now. As I went through the Seder, I also was struck by how many aspects of the Seder feel wildly inappropriate and others that feel more appropriate than ever. So first of all, of course, Chag HaCherut, the holiday of freedom. It felt wildly inappropriate to keep referring to it as the holiday of freedom and to talk about freedom when we know that our hostages, our brothers and sisters, are still there. The idea of holding up the matzah at the beginning of the Seder and saying, Halach ma'anya, this is the bread of affliction. All who are hungry, come and eat. That's our invitation to everyone. All who are hungry, come and eat. We say this every year, and I think we often just sort of pass over it, to use the word of the holiday. But this year it resonated. We know that the hostages have been, when they're eating, have been given a piece of pita and maybe a tomato for their entire rations for the entire day. So this idea of all who are hungry, come and eat. Wow, it hit us so hard that our own people are hungry and they cannot come and eat. This is an empty invitation. Well, there's also this line in the Seder where we say, this year enslaved, next year we will be free. And wow, I mean, that hit everyone at my Seder, that next year we will be free. And we had to wonder, is it true? Will next year, by next year, those remaining hostages actually be free? As I've told you before, no one in Israel thought that 200 plus days into the conflict, would we still have hostages there? I think we assumed that if we hit Hamas hard early, that somehow within a month we would be able to get those hostages back. And hostages who've come out said that they thought they would be there at the most 3 or 4 days. The idea that 200 plus days in, they are still there. We had to question whether we could actually say with any amount of truth, this year we are enslaved, next year we will be free. Same with next year in Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, concluding the Seder. You know, the name Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, what it really means in Hebrew is it can mean two things. Yeru means city, and Shalayim can mean peace, but it can also mean wholeness. So it can mean the city of peace. It can also mean the city of wholeness. And we had to wonder, will our people be whole next year? So over and over, we're going through the Seder and wondering, how true is this? And how much are these statements just words that might ring hollow? And I think a really big feeling here in Israel, not I think, I know, is a sense of abandonment, that we feel guilty having our Seders because we, Israelis, feel that in a way we ourselves have failed. Not just the army, not just the government, not just those in power responsible, but there's something about individual Israelis that we feel that we have let our fellow Israelis down by the fact that they are still in Gaza as we speak. You know, Israel is really a country of personal responsibility and where people take it upon themselves to make things happen. So the fact that they're not out, there is this element of personal responsibility as well. So that's the number one takeaway, is just how difficult this holiday was and how uncomfortable we are saying Chag Sameach, happy holiday, to each other. At my personal Seder, some of the things we did differently is we printed out a picture of one of the hostages. We printed out a picture of Naama Levy. She's 19. Actually, at this point, she could be 20. I don't know when her birthday is, but she is from Ra'anana, the town that we live in. And we have a little bit of a personal connection to her. Two of my kids were her counselors in a youth movement here, the conservative movement, youth movement called Noam. They were her counselor. And my other daughter went to tennis camp with her a few summers ago. And she was kidnapped on October 7th as a soldier and is one of the young women who is still there. And so we had her picture printed out at a local print shop, nice and big, and put it on a chair and set a place for her. And every time we filled a cup of wine, we filled her cup of wine as well. And we actually left her picture on the chair in our kitchen just as a reminder. And I can turn my head and look at the picture right now. It's a little bit eerie, but I think also very powerful. Um, we wrote the number 199 on a piece of masking tape and put that on our Seder plate just to remember that that was the number of days at that point that hostages are still there. And we skipped a lot of the minutia readings. There's this part in the Magid, the telling part of the Haggadah Passover Seder, where we tell the story and we get into these intricate stories about what Rabbi Tarfon was arguing with the other rabbi, and we skipped a lot of that this year. And instead, we had sort of these improvised discussions on freedom and what it means to be free. And some really big questions came up, like how much are any one of us free right now? Not just because we have our own countrymen in Gaza, but just in the world we're living in the world where Jewish college students can't even enter their campuses feeling safe. How many of us are actually free? In a world where algorithms determine what messages get sent out to us on our social media feeds and on our phones, and that these algorithms have been found to bias the other narrative, not our narrative. How much freedom do we actually have? And to what extent do we actually have the power to change things? One idea that uh, a lot of people here are talking about, those who are against the current government, they're sort of asking, what would it take for the government to actually change? And one thing I've heard a few people say is that if instead of 100,000 Israelis protesting on a Saturday night, if we could somehow get to 1 million, if there could be a 1 million man, 1 million woman, 1 million person march, if 1 million people were to mobilize, then the government would change. The idea being that those who are associated with it right now, sort of on the lower level, the Likud members who aren't high on the list, but lower on the list, they would see that they don't have a political future if 1 million came out. And so they would leave the government just to save their own hides. And then there would be a change. But there is this big feeling among many that we're stuck with the government we have for the time being. And unless we cross this threshold, there wouldn't be anything different. And we're also talking a lot about what's ahead. We're debating whether we'll even get hostages out alive at all. And we're wondering what's going to happen in the north. And I'll get to this in a little bit, but it does seem like things are once again heating up in the north and preparations for war are actually happening. So there's a lot of uncertainty here. I must say that we were, attacked by Iran 11 days ago? No one's talking about that anymore. I mean, I don't know many countries in the world where you could have 300 plus missiles and drones fired at you, and 11 days later, it's not even in the news. But we are past that. No one, I don't hear anyone talking about Iran here in Israel right now. It's a country of, we're always in the now. Eckhart Tolle would be super happy with Israelis in that sense. We're always focused on the now. We're not really able to, we don't have the luxury to think about what happened 11 days ago, or even what's going to happen 11 months from now. We're in the present tense. And right now, the present tense is this war in Gaza now going to go into its final phase, we believe, in Rafah, and a war happening in the north. So that's where we were at my Seder and a lot of the Seders of the people I know. I also want to share with you what Passover is like right now in Israel. For everything I've said, if you were to walk around the country, you would very much feel like it's the same Passover as ever. What do I mean? Israelis are going on trips. Israelis travel during Passover a lot, leave the country if they can. Israeli kids get a week off from school before Passover as well. supposedly to help clean the house, which is the biggest joke ever because they don't help clean the house. They mostly play video games or hang out with friends, but they are not cleaning the house during that extra week off. But families see it as an opportunity to go overseas. And if you book early enough, you can get an airline ticket to Cyprus or Greece or somewhere in Europe and either do a Seder with Chabad or just skip the Seder at all. A lot of Israelis who are secular don't even do the Seder when they travel. We've actually done the Leave Israel thing a couple of times and did the Seder at various Chabad houses, whether it was in Lima, Peru, or in uh, Cyprus, we did one. In Barcelona, we did another Passover Seder. They were decent. They certainly don't have the meaningfulness of doing your own. But it was a way to experience what that was like to travel during Passover. But look, a lot of Israelis were flying overseas if they could. Um, Roads are packed. Israel is a time for traffic jams during Passover, and we were caught in one the other day when we drove north to Tiberias for a day trip. There was also a huge heat wave here in Israel. For yesterday, we set a record temperature. It was, I think, in Fahrenheit, about 105 degrees yesterday in Tel Aviv at one point, breaking an 85-year-old record for the highest April temperature ever recorded in Tel Aviv. That was 2 days in a row that we had heat like that. Today, thankfully, it's supposed to be back down to a high of 77, and we're all so grateful for that. But that impacted our travel plans as well. But despite all the normalcy, we're also preparing for a war in the north and an operation in Rafah. Now, those of you who've been on this podcast from the beginning, there's a good chance that you think of me as the boy who cried war with Hezbollah. Because over and over I've said, the war is coming, the war is coming, and so far the war has not come. But I've told you before, I really do think it's a matter of when, not if. And I got some very strong inside dope this past week from someone in the army that over the next 6 weeks, there is going to be a war with Hezbollah. And we're seeing it already. We're seeing a lot more intense airstrikes against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. Yoav Gallant, the defense minister here, announced that half of Hezbollah's senior commanders in southern Lebanon have been killed, and the other half are in hiding. By the way, big difference between Israeli military personnel and Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad military personnel. Our leaders lead the troops into battle and are on the battlefield, and that's why, so sadly, you have seen so many officers killed in this war. Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, it's the opposite. The leaders go into hiding underground and send the others, including children, out onto their quote-unquote battlefield. That tells you just about everything you need to know about our varying ethics and viewpoint on human life and war and the sacrifices we're willing to make. But half of Hezbollah's senior leadership has been killed, and the other half are in hiding. And the plans supposedly are also being approved right now for the operation in Rafah, in Rafah. Rafah is the southernmost big city in Gaza. It's on the border with Egypt. It's where 1.5 million Palestinians have all moved from the north and the center. And Israel supposedly has set up 40,000 tents to evacuate the civilian population, move them out of Rafah before we move in. The goal is to eliminate the remaining, I think it's 6 battalions of Hamas that exist in southern Gaza. It's going to be very difficult because there are so many more Palestinians, Gazans there, because all those who are in the north and the center have now moved down to the south. So to separate civilian from Hamas militant is going to be very difficult. But logistically, the military has been making a lot of changes. As we were driving north to Tiberias, another very only in Israel experience, we saw trucks driving the opposite way, south, with, tow trucks. But you ever see those big tow trucks where they're not just pulling a car, but where it's actually a platform and they have the car on there? We saw those kind of tow trucks, but with tanks on them and armored personnel carriers and Humvees on them, moving from the north to the south. And they're going to be lining up on the Gaza border, ready to go into Gaza. Also, there had been only one military brigade in Gaza for the past few weeks, the Nahal Infantry Brigade, basically just holding down the fort, not really engaging forces actively, except when Small skirmishes came up, mostly just keeping the quiet until we could prepare for the next operation in Rafah. And this week, that Nahal infantry brigade came out of Gaza for some rest and relaxation and to prepare for the big incursion in. And reservists were sent in to hold down the fort. But we are now really preparing for this final operation. And most Israelis favor that. Most Israelis are very much in favor of completing this, trying to wipe Hamas out. And I expect that in the next I expect in the next 2 weeks the Rafah operation will begin, and again in the next 6 weeks the war in Lebanon will be stronger. We'll take on fuller force, a war that we will initiate, and it might not be huge. It might be a slow build of airstrikes against Hezbollah deeper and deeper into Lebanon, and to that extent it might have already been beginning. But we're beginning to see military personnel, reserves beginning to mobilize, and armory sent to the borders as we prepare for this next and hopefully final stage of the war in both places. What else are we talking about, though, now in Israel? We're also talking a lot about what's happening in the U.S. I mean, Israelis are horrified, and we'll talk about this more in detail in a little bit, but Israelis are absolutely shocked and horrified at what's happening on college campuses in the United States. And a lot of Israelis feel completely abandoned by the current U.S. administration. They feel, a lot of, they're saying Biden is allowing these Columbia students to do this. And I don't know how much you can say that Biden personally is doing it. And I know the chat on this webinar often becomes a place of politics. I'm going to ask you to please refrain from that. Keep your feelings on this to yourselves, or email me personally later. I don't want to get into it here. But amongst Israelis, there is this sense of abandonment that a few Israelis who have traveled overseas, who've lived in America, who know what American politics are like, a few Israelis have said, can you imagine that if these college students were shouting death to gays, or uprising against the blacks, or some other sort of verbiage instead of from the river to the sea, death to the Jews, death to the Zionists. It's tolerated as long as it's Jews who are being targeted, but if it were any other minority group, they would be protected and these would be shut down immediately. So there is this sense of abandonment from American politicians, certain American politicians. I won't lie to you. It's hard to find a lot of optimism in Israel right now. I don't think anyone is thinking that the immediate future looks bright. We see these two wars picking up in intensity. The hostages are still there. And yet at the same time, life is going on. Israelis are traveling. They are going out. They are going overseas. And to that extent, it is Passover as usual. But this is the dual reality that Israelis live with. That is life in Israel. In terms of some news, in a way, I don't even know where to start this week because this has been such a big news week. Not that anything all that earth-shattering happened. Well, I guess we did have some earth-shattering things happen here. Let me correct myself. We'll start with this. The newest piece of news that just came out in the last 16 hours is that this humanitarian pier is finally being built off of Gaza by the U.S. To me, the more significant piece of news is that yesterday, while United Nations officials were beginning to tour the start of this pier, bombs were fired at the pier from terrorists in Gaza. We don't know that it was Hamas. It could be Hamas. It could be Islamic Jihad. It could be some other upstart terrorist group. But as the United Nations officials were touring the pier in Gaza to bring humanitarian aid into Gaza, they were fired upon and they had to take shelter. These UN officials actually had to scurry to a shelter to stay safe while they were being attacked by terrorists on this pier. And, if anything would make clear to these UN officials what is happening in Gaza, this should be it. When they themselves are looking at a pier designed to bring aid into Gaza and they are being fired upon, this shows you what these terrorist groups actually want. It is not food and aid and the well-being of their civilians. It is the destruction of Israel, and if they need to sacrifice their own people in order for that to happen, so be it. Why would they bomb this pier? Because they don't want aid coming in. This is not about aid. This is not about the flourishing of Gazan society. This is not about keeping Gazans alive. It is about sabotaging any kind of relationship with Israel, and being victims so that the world will continue to see them as victims. And it's not in their interest to have this pier built. Sort of contradictory. It's contradictory logic, but that's the reason they were bombed. So that was one piece of news. Another big piece of news. Yesterday, Hamas stated that they would lay down their arms in exchange for a Palestinian state in the West Bank in Gaza Strip. To which most Israelis said, "Are you effing kidding me?" No Israeli, when they heard this, thought, this is our chance, including myself. I've been a big proponent of having a Palestinian state in Gaza in the West Bank. I think it's the only way for our own security is to have separation from them, hold them accountable, have a government there that has to answer to the rest of the world. No more talk of occupation and resistance. Give them a state that we don't have to love them. I mean, you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. But at least then we have the separation and clear boundaries. But none of us, myself included, think that this is a viable proposal from Hamas. No, they did state that they would lay down their arms if they had a Palestinian state in Gaza and the West Bank. However, this totally contradicts their charter. The Hamas charter calls for the elimination of Israel and the retaking of all land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. So it's not like they're changing their charter. This is simply lip service. Also, in this same interview, the Hamas official said that they have no regrets for what happened on October 7th. So believe me, there is no way that any Israeli hears this and thinks that this is the opportunity we've been looking for. I personally feel that we need to have a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, but it needs to be negotiated with the world's support. It needs to be demilitarized with clear borders and buffer zones. In any case, I can pretty much promise you that this is not going to happen, at least in the immediate future, for a couple of reasons. First of all, what Hamas is calling for is a state with pre-1967 borders. And what would that mean? That would mean the Golan Heights, it would mean Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem would all be part of a Palestinian state. I must point out that in many ways, this is not so different from what past Israeli prime ministers have offered to Palestinian leadership, whether it was in the year 2000 when Ehud Barak made a very generous offer to Yasser Arafat, and Arafat walked away from that, much to the chagrin of many in the Arab world, and also President Clinton. And Ehud Barak also had an offer on the table to give the Golan Heights to Syria, and that never came about. So it's not like these were never viable options. These were options that were presented to the Palestinians, but were rejected. And now they have the absolute chutzpah to carry out the October 7th attacks and then say, now we want what you offered us 24 years ago. Israelis are not going to go for it. There's also the sense of reward, that this would be rewarding this kind of behavior, whether it's the taking of hostages, the attacking of Israel and Israelis are absolutely not ready to give that kind of a reward. Israelis want to see Hamas destroyed. We're ready to go into Rafah, and we're also sensing that Hamas actually might be at its weakest point yet, and I'll explain why in a minute. But taking all of this together, we're seeing that this is the time to go into Rafah and complete this operation. And by the way, another thing Israelis are saying right now is regarding, what will the world think if we go into Rafah, and there are a lot of civilian casualties. A lot of Israelis are shrugging their shoulders and saying, well, look what they're doing right now. Look what the world is saying right now. We haven't even gone into Rafah. And you see these protests, you see the anti-Israel sentiment. How much different would it be if we actually went in? We don't think that world opinion really changes based on our behavior. World opinion is what it is because we're Jews and because we're Israel, and there's bias. So there's not this sense that we need to be cognizant of world opinion at this point. That's the other piece, the second piece of news. This is related to another big piece of news that came out of Israel this week, which is the video of Hersh Polin that was released a couple days ago. Just on a personal note, I went to Camp Ramah in Wisconsin with Hersh's father, Jon Polin. I didn't know him that well, but I remember him. He's a couple years older than me. I remember him playing basketball and knew him a little bit. And it's amazing how many of us have personal connections with hostages and soldiers in this war. But that's another little connection that I have. I will say this. When Israelis saw the video of Hersh Polin, we felt a mixture of joy, absolute joy that this young man who has become the face at this point of the hostages is still alive. But on the other hand, at the same time, we felt outright anger and frustration and disappointment and a sense of failure that after 200 days, he and the others are still there. So it was very mixed, a very mixed emotion for us to see this video. Now, let's talk about why this video was released. In my opinion, this is a sign that Hamas is weakening, and they're making another last-ditch effort to try to salvage their power. And here's why I say this. Hamas is savvy. They're aware of what's happening in Israel, Israeli society. They know that at this point, Hersh has become the face of the hostages. For a while, it was the two Bibas children, but you really don't hear much talk about the Bibas children anymore. Their pictures used to be everywhere. You don't see their pictures everywhere anymore. I think it's largely assumed that these children would have been let out already if Hamas knew where they were, if they were able to locate them, if they were still alive. So they're no longer really the face. Hersh has become the face, in large part because of the work of his parents. You know, his mother, Rachel, was named at the Time 100. There is a momentum behind their work that has elevated Hersh to become the representative of all the hostages right now. And Hamas knows this. And that's why they released the video of him. On the one hand, it's so painful for us seeing him. He's recognizable. But I think it's also dangling the carrot in front of our eyes and trying to push us to avoid going into Rafah, because they're igniting this fear we have of killing our own hostages, which has happened until now. So I don't think it's by chance that the video was released this week, and I don't think by it's chance that it was Hersh who was in the video and not some other hostage. Hamas wants to raise the emotional level, tap into the emotions we have about all the hostages, and he is the most salient one. He is the one who most, when you talk about the static electricity, he's the one who attracts the most electricity to our feelings, and that's why they released the video of him. It was noticeable. A lot of Israelis noticed that he was missing his hand, his arm from the mid forearm down, and there's speculation: did he have we assume he had surgery. How healthy was it? Was he given anesthesia? There wasn't really any explanation in the video, but this was a big piece of news for us in Israel, and with a lot of mixed emotion that on the one hand, he's still alive, but on the other, like I said, this sense of how can it be that 200 plus days, all this time, he's still there, and these others are still there. I think some Israelis wanted to believe that all the hostages had been. Sometimes you won't hear them say this out loud, but I think some Israelis wanted to believe that maybe all the hostages had been killed, just as a way of relieving ourselves of the horror of thinking of what it's like to exist in Gaza as a hostage. There was almost this sense of relief that if they were killed, at least they wouldn't have to endure the hell that is there. And seeing Hersh alive reminded us that for 200 plus days, there have been hostages who have had to be alive there with these barbarians. And on the one hand is joy that he's still there and joy that they're still alive. On the other hand, this sense of how did we not bring them home until now? And are we ever going to bring them home? Another piece of news is that the head of Israeli intelligence, IDF intelligence, Major General Aharon Chaviva, resigned this week for his inability to prevent the October 7th attacks. As we've talked about before on this broadcast, at first the question was, how did we miss the intelligence? But then we quickly realized we didn't miss it. We just didn't pay attention to it. We had all the intelligence we needed to prevent October 7th. And, many Israelis said after the attack by Iran, which we foiled, if only we'd taken the intelligence as seriously on October 6th as we did in the days leading up to the attack against Iran, then it never would have happened. But in any case, this Major General Aharon Chaviva stepped down from his post as the head of IDF intelligence. And I must say, the reaction here was mixed. There were those who definitely said, good, finally someone is taking responsibility. But others said, this isn't good. This is the one person who at this point probably knows the most about the enemy, is most aware of the intelligence situation now. And better that he should stay in. Here he is abandoning us once again. There was also some really cynical talk about just what kind of life he's going to go into now. And there were those who saying, fine, if you're going to resign, you should also give up your very sweet military pension. When you're an officer in the Israeli army and you retire, you're set for life. You get a very generous pension, a lot of benefits, discounts at restaurants, movies, activities, you name it. And people are saying, you want to resign? Fine, but you need to give up all of those perks as well. You should give up all of your pension as well. And you should sign some sort of document stating that you will never serve in any form of public service again. And you will not be a part of any think tank, and you will not give any speeches for a lot of money, because we've seen this before where military personnel step down in many countries, the US as well, where they step down, ask forgiveness for their mistakes and then go on the lecture circuit or write books or become part of think tanks and or lobbyists and start pulling in the bucks. And so there's a lot of cynicism here. You need to give up that as well. It's not just enough that you absolve yourself of the responsibility and then step down. We should also note that the new head of the intelligence was his former assistant, the vice head of intelligence. So how much better was that? Because this person was also involved in not being able to prevent October 7th. But that was another big piece of news here. And then, of course, what's happening on college campuses, which is not really a piece of news in Israel, but absolutely must be addressed here. Every day it starts with Columbia, and then it's Yale. University of Southern California canceled their graduation. I mean, let's wrap our heads around that. They've canceled their graduation ceremonies because of anti-Israel protest. University of Texas, I have a little connection there. That's where my dad went to medical school. My family all came into the United States through Texas. They were part of the movement of Russian Jews who came to Ellis Island. They were turned away and said, no more Jews allowed. We're going to send you down south. And so they came in through Galveston. So University of Texas is a place where a lot of my family went to school. It is simply unbelievable. It's unfathomable what is happening there. And it's really become, I'm not going to tell you new facts because you can see the facts anywhere. You can see the numbers. I want to give you a little perspective of how I see this. Why is this happening, in my opinion? First of all, it's become the cool thing to do. I mean, hating Israel and protesting Israel is simply the cool thing to do on campus right now. And I assure you that the majority of these kids have no freaking idea of what the situation actually is, or what river or sea we're talking about, or any of the history behind the land. It's simply a cool movement to join. And you got to ask, who are these kids? I think there's a reason it's happening at Yale and Columbia and Emory and University of Texas, which is a very difficult school to get into. And it's not happening at the University of Illinois or Florida State or some of these schools that are strong, but maybe a tier down in the kind of typical U.S. News World Report analysis of which schools are elite and which aren't. These are sort of elite schools with quote unquote elite students. Who are these students? I mean, these are students who have been told from the time they are babies that they are wonderful and perfect and can do no wrong. They have been given tutors. You don't get into one of these schools unless you've received a heavy dose of tutoring and essay help These are not students who, by and large, have pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and done it on their own. They have been prodded and pampered the entire way. And I think there's a lot of internal guilt among these students that they have simply been handed this good life and access to these schools, and yet they've never had to do anything for themselves. They've never had to actually fight the fight. You know, I've when I've traveled, I'll sometimes go to events in these cities if I have a night off. I'll go to a concert, go to a speaking event. And so many of these college campuses, before the event begins, or in towns, in cities, before an event begins, someone will get up on stage and they will say, we want to acknowledge that the land we are on right now actually used to belong to this and this Native American tribe, and we forcibly took this land. And now, ladies and gentlemen, let's enjoy our concert. So there's this sense of guilt that they too are maybe guilty of taking land from others. And the only way to deal with this cognitive dissonance is to fight the fight and take it to the man and take it to the colonialists. And they live, these college students, in this dual world of either oppressor or oppressed. And they see Israel as the oppressor, and they see it as their mission to rise up against the oppressor. And that's why it's become the cool thing to do on these campuses. These kids have never actually had to stand up and put their lives on the line for something they believe in. You know, I just compare these college students who, with the 18, 19, 20-year-old Israelis I see here, who are spending months at a time in Gaza, who are putting on the uniform, picking up the rifle, being away from their families, turning in their cell phones for weeks at a time as they go into these war zones, and really putting their lives on the line for their country, to a cause that's bigger than themselves. I assure you, none of these kids would actually put their lives on the line when it came to that. They're not going to join any military where they would be in danger. They're not going to join any movement where they would actually be endangered. It's all under the safety and the protection of university police, and they can hold up their cell phone and film the police who are arresting them. It's a game. It's a game that they want to be a part of. It's a fad, not a fad like the hula hoop, which is going to go away, but a fad in the sense that it's cool and it's catching like wildfire. And it's just such an easy way to get attention as well, and to feel like they're doing something worthy with their time. And again, I think a lot of it comes from this sense of internal guilt that they've never actually had to work all that hard. And they've been given access while others don't. And they want to show that they have it tough too, and they're willing to fight the fight as well. But it's complete and absolute BS. And I don't know if they'll ever wake up to the truth. It does make me worried for the future of American politics, that these could be the future leaders and the future voters for sure. But it reminded me very much about the Passover children. You know, we have the 4 children at Passover: the wise, the wicked, the simple, and the one who doesn't know how to ask. These college students, very much to me, are the last category of child. They are the ones who don't know how to ask. Or maybe more specifically, they're the ones who don't even think they have to ask. Because, like I said, they've been told from such an early age that they're perfect and can do no wrong. And so it never occurs to them to question their own opinions. They don't have the humility to think, maybe I should ask. Maybe the supposed truth that I've heard and that I believe isn't the full truth, or isn't truth at all. That requires a certain humility, which I don't see this generation of glass children having. And so of all the kids, they don't strike me as the wicked child. They strike me as the ones who don't know how to ask, simply because they don't have the humility to lower themselves to the position where they might think they need to ask a question. And speaking of questions, let's go on to 3 questions that you sent in this week. So the first question is from Harriet, who I met in Potomac, Maryland, at a show at Har Shalom in Potomac. Wow, already 6 weeks ago. Feels like just yesterday. Harriet wrote, regarding the video of Hersh Polin, I'd be curious to know whether you think that he, as an American, has an advantage over other hostages in terms of getting released. And the answer is no. Me, personally, I don't think that Hersh or any of the others with American or other citizenship have an an advantage. I think Hamas, if they were to release anyone, it would be women, remaining women, children, elderly, sick. Hamas categorizes all males who are 18 and older as soldiers, as members of the military Zionist occupation forces. That includes Hersh, that includes men in their 70s. So men, by virtue of them being deemed as soldiers, Zionist occupied force members by Hamas, do not have any sort of advantage. And I don't think citizenship has any advantage at this point. There have been talks about what deals might or might happen. And now the latest piece of news that we're hearing in Israel is that Israel is trying to negotiate a deal that would call for the release of only 20 hostages. And then someone else in Israeli administration said, no, actually it's 33. So not 40. Before we were talking about the release of 40 hostages. Now it's down to 20 or 33, depending on which number you'd believe. I still don't think it's going to happen. At the same time, many Israelis are upset about this negotiations in pieces. Most Israelis are saying we need to get all the hostages out. And if we don't, we need to just absolutely decimate Hamas. But this whole idea of taking hostages out in stages is really sickening to a lot of Israelis, because what it means is that we're just abandoning more and more and abandoning the rest. But to answer your question, Harriet, no, I don't see being American as having an advantage for Hersh or for anyone else. Joanne asked, we hear that Gaza is tamed, but still rockets are being fired and Hamas is resurfacing in the north. Why is this happening? Also, can you comment about what options Israel has, what options to make the north of Israel habitable again? So let's go to the first part of the question. Why are we still seeing rockets fired from the south? It's true. It's a big problem. Israel will clear out the north and the center of Gaza, then move south, and Hamas will be able to resurface in the center and the north here and there and fire rockets. I don't have a great answer for why, except for the fact that Hamas here and there is able to sneak back toward the north and the center, and they still have rocket launchers in place. Now, to be clear, it's far fewer rockets than were launched before, and the whole idea of clearing out northern and central Gaza first is that we then push Hamas away from most of Israel, and so their rockets can no longer reach Israeli territory, which is why we're seeing so many fewer rockets. But look, until the last Hamas militant is killed and the last rocket launcher is destroyed, it's going to be very hard to prevent rockets from being fired into Israel from Gaza. That's the truth. And in terms of making the north, the Galil, habitable again, the Galilee, it would take Hezbollah being pushed away from the border, which is why we think this war is going to happen soon. Right now, we still have, I think, 80,000 Israelis who are in the north who are not living in their homes, Kiryat Shmona and other northern towns, refugees. And in order to allow them to go back, we would have to have this rocket fire from Hezbollah stop. And that can happen either by the honoring of a United Nations resolution from 2016 calling for Hezbollah to be a certain distance away from the border. The United Nations has not seen fit to enforce this resolution. So the other option is to engage in a war with Hezbollah and defeat them and destroy their forces in the south and in central Lebanon as well. And that's what it would take. But we cannot allow our civilians to return to the north until we know that they can actually live there and not be fired upon by rockets and drones from Hezbollah. And Eric asks, I like questions like this because they're totally off topic, and yet I think people like these insights into Israeli life. Eric asks, my question for you is, what is an easy way to start a conversation with an Israeli or to engage an Israeli in conversation? And I would say it's actually pretty easy. Israelis are pretty willing to talk. I would start out, Eric, by just telling them that we support you and our hearts are with you and we're thinking of you. And then go ahead and be Dugri. In my book, Israel 201, I talk about characteristics of the Israeli, and one of them is Dugri. Dugri means straight to the point, openness. Americans tend to beat around the bush, not Israelis. Israelis go straight to the point, and they say the no boundaries. They say even what they're not supposed to say. Um, there's no sense of, will I hurt your feelings? It's just, am I telling the truth? And I would say just tell the truth. Ask the questions you're curious about. What's it like to live during this challenging time? Do you know anyone who's in the army right now? You can even ask, do you know any of the hostages? I'm curious. Israelis are happy to talk about their connections to everything going on right now. Even if the topic is sad, it means a lot to Israelis to know that Jews and others elsewhere in the world are thinking of us and care about us. And it's really opened their eyes that there is so much care around the world from the Jewish community. And another way to engage an Israeli in conversation, tell them what you're going through. Tell them what it's like to be um, a Jew in wherever you're from, whether it's the US, Canada, UK. I think Israelis are very curious about that as well. Our eyes have been opened to how difficult it is being Jewish, even in the year 2024, in other places around the world. But Israelis are happy to talk with you. You just got to be willing to be straightforward and come out and speak honestly. But you will, I think you'll find a good conversation behind that. I want to leave you with a little insider perspective on daily life here, something completely unrelated to all the conflict and everything else that's going on. Yesterday, I got a flat tire here in Israel. And I can honestly say it is probably the 10th, 11th, 12th flat tire I've gotten since moving to Israel just over 7 years ago. And the reason is that the streets in Israel are filled with nails and screws. Mostly parking lots where you park your car next to your apartment are filled with these nails and screws. And the reason is there is so much construction going on in Israel right now because of the housing boom and also because of Tama 38, which is a policy to rebuild apartment buildings to make them strong for the earthquake that we're expecting to hit in the next 50 years, probably sooner, as if we didn't have enough on our plates. There's so much building going on that naturally screws and nails fall from the construction sites into the parking lots where we park our cars and constantly are puncturing our tires. And I just thought about that yesterday as I was changing my tire at the shop where I already know the guy and I'm on a first name basis with him. Just how uniquely Israeli this experience is having to change your tires over and over. And that you need to budget a certain amount of money every year just for changing your tires. But if you come to Israel on a visit, or if you've been here or are here right now, you'll see how many construction cranes there are everywhere you go. Anywhere you stand in the center of Israel, Tel Aviv, Herzliya, Ra'anana, Kfar Saba, just stop, look around. I guarantee you can count at least 3, 4, 5 construction cranes because there is such a building boom going on in the country. But one of the results is that the equipment falls off these construction sites and into our parking lots and punctures the tires to our car. And so I hate to say it, but this by far will not be my final visit to the tire puncture fixer guy. But as we say in Hebrew, "Shezeh bayot achi kashot shlanu," right? That this should be our biggest trouble in life, a flat tire. I want to thank all of you for joining me tonight on Inside Israel. As always, you can hear this as a podcast and watch the video of this recording on my website, which I'm going to put right here in the chat. It's just joelchasnoff.com/podcast. So again, if you go to joelchasnoff.com/podcast, you'll have links to Apple Podcasts and Spotify Podcasts. I will ask you, if you go to one of those places, please give this podcast a rating. The best way to get it out there is for you, the listener, to give it a rating, ideally 5 stars, but I'll leave it to you. But when you give these ratings, Apple and Spotify push it out to everyone else. You can also watch the video on my website at joelchasnoff.com/podcast. And within about 12 hours, you'll see the video of this recording up and you can watch it there. If you want the links to receive if you want to be part of this live webinar that I do every week, the links, again, you get them at the same page on my website. There's a little box where you put your name and email address in, and then every week you'll get my newsletter, Hebrew's Magic, which also, in addition to insights about Hebrew words, has the links for these webinars. Always send your questions to me ahead of time if you can. Our next broadcast will be next Thursday. I don't even know what the date is next Thursday. Is it May 2nd? I'm going to take a stab in the dark. Next Thursday, May 2nd, 5th, 5, 4th, yeah, 2. So May 2nd, next Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. After Passover, we'll try to go back to our Monday or Tuesday broadcast. But for now, we need to stick with Thursdays until the holiday is over in the U.S. One nice thing about living in Israel, Passover is only 7 days. It's not just a day. It's a huge psychological relief to not have to do 2 Seders. Also, life in many ways is better in Israel. I will see you next week. Thanks so much for joining this edition of Inside Israel with Joel Chasnoff. Until next time. Lehitraot and Rak Beshalom. Bye-bye. I'll leave the chat open for a couple more minutes so you can hang out.